unimaginative and frustrating, said Hollywood's Bible Variety magazine.
And they get told by Meghan Markle, oh no, you got to take those pictures down. You need to take those pictures down. And then Meghan will turn around and tell a psychic, yeah, share this picture, share this personal note.
People do not pack up their lives quietly unless something already cracked behind closed doors. When a move happens without noise, it usually means the shift came long before the boxes. In Montecito, Prince Harry was supposed to be starting over, away from royal control, away from constant eyes, away from the history that followed him everywhere. But distance did not bring peace. It brought clarity. Sources close to palace circles say what caught Harry off guard was not talk or speculation. It was documentation, hard material, files that pointed back to a period of Meghan Markle's life he believed had no relevance to their present, a phase he thought was settled and left behind. Nothing hit him all at once. It built slowly. One name led to another. Dates overlapped where they should not have. Certain connections did not line up with what he thought he understood. The deeper he looked, the more the picture shifted. Once the pattern became clear, ignoring it was no longer an option. This is not about a dramatic reveal or a public fallout. It is about awareness, about what happens when a carefully managed image runs into written records. The same man who once walked away from the palace may now be stepping away from something far more personal. When Harry opened the folder, he expected routine material. No bold labels, no alarms, just standard paperwork connected to legal prep, security assessments, and reputation reviews. The kind of process that quietly starts when pressure begins to rise elsewhere. One name kept showing up in the paperwork over and over again: Soho House. Publicly, it had always been brushed off as background noise in Meghan Markle's early years. Just a trendy members club, a hangout for creatives, a place where actors, producers, and industry people casually crossed paths. That version made things feel light and harmless. The material Harry saw painted a different picture. Within elite networks, Soho House is not just a social spot. It is a system. Membership is selective, entry is monitored, introductions are intentional, movements tied to global openings are tracked carefully. Nothing about it runs loose. Guest interactions matter. Overlapping attendance matters. Even when moments are not documented publicly, they stay logged in private circles. When institutions review history, they are not chasing drama, they are tracing consistency. This was the first time Meghan Markle appeared in those records in a way Harry had never been shown before. The file made no accusations. It did not jump to conclusions. It simply laid out timelines, international Soho House locations, cities where Meghan surfaced without clear work obligations, crossovers with individuals already known for access to private travel, yachts, and locked-in social environments. On their own, the entries looked ordinary. Together, they formed a pattern Harry did not recognize. He had believed this part of her past was fully explained, framed, and done. What rattled him was realizing the palace never saw it that way at all. Inside Buckingham Palace, none of this information came as a surprise. According to individuals familiar with internal reviews, Soho House had surfaced years earlier during early background checks. It was never flagged as dangerous. It was treated as a variable, a passageway where influential people moved through quietly, often leaving no trace beyond private recollection. At the time, there was no justification to step in. The relationship was accelerating fast. Harry was emotionally locked in, deeply committed, and advisors knew pressing him then would have caused resistance. So the palace followed its usual approach. It documented, it archived, it waited. The material Harry eventually saw in Montecito existed because of that delay, not because of a sudden discovery. As Harry went through the timelines and layered references, his first instinct was disbelief. People familiar with his reactions say he assumed something had been left out, that there had to be explanations filed somewhere else. He asked questions. Who put this together? When it began? Why he had never been shown any of it before? The responses were formal and restrained. The file had grown over time, updated only when new data appeared. It had never been escalated because escalation demands certainty. The palace did not need certainty. It needed awareness. That distinction caused friction behind closed doors. One group, largely senior courtiers and legal advisors shaped by the Prince Andrew fallout, believed Harry should never have seen the material. From their perspective, the danger was emotional, not institutional. Harry's mental balance mattered. Reopening unresolved corridors would only add strain. Another group pushed back. Harry was no longer operating inside the system. He was acting independently, publicly, and financially. Withholding information was no longer realistic. If external investigations or sworn testimony ever brushed up against Soho House records, Harry needed private awareness, not public shock. That position carried the day. For Harry, the reaction was immediate and personal. This was not tabloid chatter. This was institutional memory. Dates lining up against moments Meghan had previously described differently. Travel once explained as coincidence now looked intentional. Access once labeled networking appeared curated. When Harry raised the issue with Meghan, the exchange reportedly turned tense. According to intermediaries, she rejected the file outright, calling it institutional paranoia rather than fact. She pushed back immediately. Soho House, she said, was social, not calculated, casual, not tactical. She accused the palace of stretching meaning where none belonged, of turning ordinary connections into something darker than they were. Then she asked the question that shifted everything. Why would Harry place more trust in palace paperwork than in her own words? That moment changed the shape of the conflict. It stopped being about documents. It became about loyalty. Harry, already unsettled, found himself cast as the problem simply for reading what had been preserved. The file never accused Meghan of misconduct, but it exposed gaps. It challenged the idea that everything had already been explained. Once that doubt entered his mind, it stayed there. The tension escalated fast, not loudly, but deeply. According to people close to the situation, Harry pulled back behind the scenes. Conversations about the future slowed. Decisions stalled. Joint plans were postponed. The Montecito house did not turn hostile, but it grew fragile, like one wrong move could crack it open. The real antagonist was not Meghan. It was not the palace either. It was the record itself. Records do not defend themselves. They do not argue. They wait. And once interpretation becomes personal, the weight turns heavy. When Harry eventually left Montecito, there was no statement because there was nothing to announce. Distance did not mean an ending. It meant space from information he could not yet absorb. From London, the palace stayed silent. They did not need to speak. Institutions rely on time more than press releases. Once information is uncovered, it never fully goes quiet again. By this point, Harry understood something crucial. The palace had not suddenly uncovered Soho House. It had always been aware. The difference was that now he was aware too. After the file surfaced, the mood in Montecito shifted in measurable ways. Conversations shortened, momentum slowed. People familiar with the situation say nothing dramatic happened, but everything felt heavier.
Less than kind, unimaginative and frustrating, said Hollywood's Bible, Variety magazine. So sickening, I almost brought up my breakfast, said the woke Bible, The Guardian. All the intimacy of Instagram, sneered the normally timid New York Times. A nauseating self-serving snooze fest, said another pundit. Well, that was me.
Harry stopped treating the material as background and started treating it as something that needed verification. His first move was procedural. He asked who had compiled the file. The answer disturbed him. There was no single author, no mastermind. It was an accumulation. Early vetting notes, updates added when familiar names or dates resurfaced elsewhere, references drawn from travel records, membership overlaps, and third-party briefings. The file was never meant to tell a story. It existed to preserve memory. That difference mattered. Harry had believed institutions create narratives to control outcomes. What he was now facing was colder than that. Institutions collect information even before they know what it means. They do not wait for conclusions. They only need relevance. Harry asked if the file contained accusations. He was told it did not. He asked whether it implied wrongdoing. The answer did not come easily. He was told there were no allegations inside the file. When he asked why it existed at all, the answer came back clean and procedural. Soho House operated as a controlled access space, and Meghan Markle's presence there intersected more than once with individuals who were already documented for entirely separate reasons. That explanation changed the weight of everything. This was no longer about concealing a past. It was about connections, about a setting the palace had long treated as a quiet passage between social worlds that rarely meet in public view. The file did not describe what happened behind closed doors. It did not speculate. It simply confirmed who crossed paths within them. As Harry's reaction shifted from shock to unease, people close to him say his questions became more specific. Which cities? Which years? Whether the overlaps happened before their relationship, Whether any of the timelines brushed up against moments where he remembered being told different versions, each response brought clarity without comfort. Nothing directly disproved Meghan's explanations, but nothing fully reinforced them either. The gaps stayed open. When Harry brought those questions back home, the tone changed. Meghan reportedly pushed back harder. She framed the material as institutional overreach. In her view, Soho House was being distorted after the fact. Ordinary networking was being retrofitted into suspicion. She challenged why old records were resurfacing at all, and reminded Harry that the palace had never approached her without bias. From her perspective, the file was not about protection or context. It was proof of a system that never trusted her in the first place. That left Harry caught between two sources of authority. On one side stood the palace, speaking in technical language, refusing to draw conclusions, but standing by the records. On the other side stood his wife, framing the issue as personal betrayal and demanding belief over documentation. At that point, the conflict stopped being about information. It became about which framework Harry was willing to accept. This was the point where palace leadership split again. One side believed Harry needed to fully disengage. In their view, once institutional material spilled into a personal conflict, it stopped serving a purpose. Their concerns centered on Harry's emotional well-being and the risk of the situation spiraling. They advised stepping back and keeping the file sealed within palace systems. The opposing side argued that stepping away was no longer realistic. Harry already understood that outside forces, including media pressure and unrelated legal matters, could eventually pull these records back into view. From that angle, information was a form of protection, painful but necessary. Harry followed neither path. According to people familiar with his behavior during this period, he began pulling away from both sides. He stopped asking the palace for clarification. He stopped pushing the issue at home. Rather than choosing a position, he chose distance. The withdrawal was quiet but noticeable. Travel plans were delayed. Public appearances were postponed. Communication narrowed. Physical space increased and emotional space followed. No one labeled it a crisis, but the pressure was building beneath the surface. Without any formal declaration, the stakes rose again. When Harry asked whether the file had ever circulated outside palace walls, he was told it had not. That reassurance came with an important qualifier. Institutional memory does not fade. Records remain dormant until circumstances shift. Files are revisited when relevance returns. If future events ever made Soho House a focal point again, the material would reappear not as an accusation, but as background context. That was when the long-term consequences finally landed for Harry. There was no quick fix here, no statement could smooth it over, no interview could shut it down. There was nothing concrete to deny because there was no accusation to fight. What existed was a preserved pattern, sitting quietly inside institutional memory, waiting for the moment it mattered. Meghan's reaction, according to people close to her, was practical. She believed the answer was distance. Distance from the palace, distance from its systems, distance from how it thinks. In her view, the fact that the institution refused to draw conclusions proved the material carried no weight.
I think it's really cruel to her husband to do that. And you look at this situation, you go, yeah, I'm not surprised that Meghan would go in this direction.
If it truly mattered, action would have followed. Since it had not, the past should stay buried. Harry did not see it that way. He had grown up inside institutions that rarely move early. Silence was not dismissal, it was restraint. Waiting was not weakness, it was strategy. Once relevance activates, it does not expire. That gap in interpretation deepened the divide between them. He began spending more time away from Montecito, not announced trips, quiet absences, time with advisors, time alone, time re-examining decisions he once thought were settled. People who observed him during this period say the anger had faded. What remained looked more like acceptance. The shock had worn off. What followed was recalibration. The force driving this chapter was not Meghan and not the palace. It was the collision between narrative and record. Narratives need alignment. Records tolerate contradiction. Harry had spent years trying to control how his story was told. The file pushed him into a world where control does not belong to the individual. By the end of this phase, the decision to leave Montecito had effectively been made, even if it had not been stated. Leaving was not about running, it was about space. space to think without being forced to pick a side. The palace did not react because it did not need to. It had not pressured him. It had not accused anyone. It had allowed information to exist, and the consequences were unfolding on their own. Harry came to understand something fundamental. Institutional files do not close because someone wants them to. They close only when relevance disappears, and relevance, once established, rarely does. That realization did not bring peace. It brought distance. Distance became the only way he felt he could regain control. By the time Harry physically left Montecito, the palace had already settled on its position. It would not intervene. It would not clarify. It would not deny. From an institutional view, there was nothing to address publicly. No allegation had been made. No claim had been issued. The situation was categorized as internal awareness with external sensitivity. That classification comes with a specific response: observe, document, do not engage. Engagement creates obligation. Silence preserves flexibility. This approach was debated. One faction, largely senior communications advisors, believed Harry's absence would spark speculation. They argued that a brief reassurance could prevent escalation. Another faction disagreed. Legal and protocol advisors warned that even a mild statement would create a public link between the palace and the Soho House records. Once that connection existed, it could not be undone. Their view prevailed. The palace would not validate or dispute information it had never acknowledged. From the palace's standpoint, Harry was no longer a working royal. His residence, marriage, and personal choices were outside institutional responsibility. The palace believed it had already provided appropriate awareness by granting access to the records. What Harry did with that knowledge was his decision. Harry experienced that neutrality as abandonment. People familiar with his reaction say he interpreted the silence as confirmation. To him, refusal to deny felt like acknowledgement. For the institution, silence meant containment. That difference widened the distance that had been growing for years. As Harry relocated temporarily, advisors on both sides reassessed risk. For the palace, the risk was reputational proximity. Any visible alignment during uncertainty could pull the crown into future disputes. Distance reduced exposure. The calculation was procedural, not emotional. For Harry, the risk was internal coherence. He was forced to hold two realities at once. The woman he loved presented her past as settled. The institution that raised him preserved that same past as unresolved. Neither side accused, neither side offered closure. That is where the true conflict became clear. It was not Meghan Markle. It was not the palace. It was record versus narrative. Narratives depend on trust. Records depend on retention. When those diverge, institutions side with record. Individuals lean toward narrative. Harry was caught between both without a clean way out. According to people familiar with Meghan's thinking, she viewed Harry's need for distance as unnecessary. From her perspective, the file proved nothing. The palace's inaction confirmed irrelevance. Ignoring institutional memory was, to her, the correct move. Harry did not share that confidence. He was raised in systems where documentation defines legitimacy. He knew the palace waits. It observes. It allows relevance to reveal itself. That understanding made it impossible for him to dismiss the file even without accusation. Externally, things stabilized. No statements, no leaks. Media attention stayed contained because there was nothing concrete to pursue. That outcome validated the palace's strategy. Silence had worked, but silence did not bring resolution. According to those close to Harry, the time away forced him to reassess more than just the file. He questioned assumptions he had accepted too quickly. Decisions made under pressure, conflicts he had framed as persecution rather than warning. The records did not give answers. They raised questions he could no longer avoid. The most unsettling realization was not about the past, it was about the present. If the palace had always known and chosen to wait, then leaving the institution had not erased its memory. It had only removed him from its protection. The knowledge still existed. The files still existed. They simply no longer required his participation. That understanding changed him. When Harry returned, he did not come back demanding certainty. He came back guarded, more careful, less absolute. People who observed him afterwards say he stopped seeking clean conclusions and started preparing for uncertainty. That is how royal stories usually end. The palace does not need to speak because the structure has already done its work. Information is shared, responsibility shifts, silence protects the institution and leaves the individual to manage the aftermath. For Harry, leaving Montecito was not an escape from the past. It was recognition that once the past is documented, it does not disappear when ignored. It waits, and when it returns, it does so on institutional terms, not personal ones. By the time the dust settled, nothing had exploded. No charges, no statements, no public reckoning. And that was the point. In royal systems, silence is not absence. It is structure doing what it was designed to do. Prince Harry did not leave Montecito chasing answers. He left understanding something colder. The past does not need to accuse anyone to matter. It only needs to exist in record form.
People are just sort of wising up to this pair who claim to be very successful, very talented, all these sorts of things. And then you see the end result and go, oh no, they're not really. And then you add on to that.
Once written down, it becomes patient. It waits for timing, not permission. This was never about proving guilt or innocence. It was about incompatibility. One side believed the past was finished because no one acted on it. The other understood that institutions rarely act until they must. Those two views cannot live comfortably together. The palace did not intervene because it did not need to. From its perspective, the process had already worked. Information had been preserved. Awareness had been transferred. Responsibility had shifted. What followed was no longer institutional business. For Harry, that realization changed everything. He stopped demanding clarity. He stopped pushing for resolution. He accepted that some records are not meant to be closed by emotion or explanation. They fade only when relevance disappears, and relevance is not something individuals control. That is where this chapter ends. Not with answers, but with distance. Not with blame, but with awareness. The story does not conclude because institutions rarely offer endings. They offer memory. And this is why stories like this matter. Not because of scandal, but because of how power actually works when cameras are gone. The real moves happen quietly. The real pressure builds slowly. And the real consequences show up long after the headlines move on. If you want coverage that does not just repeat talking points, but breaks down how these systems operate behind closed doors, that is exactly what Barz does. We track the details others gloss over. We follow the paper trails. We explain why silence is sometimes louder than statements. Stay with Barz for the stories that do not end when the cameras shut off. If this saga had you shook, wait till you see what's next. You already know what it is. Barz got the real, raw, and unfiltered breakdowns. So don't forget to like, subscribe, drop a comment, and share this with someone who needs to catch up.